It was 4 o'clock in the morning on the day of my wedding, and my mother was standing behind me with a mouthful of hairpins. I was sitting on a wooden chair in my parents' bedroom because it held the only mirror in the house, and even that one was small, the size of a dinner plate, hung low on the wall so my father could shave. My wedding dress was on a hook on the back of the door. It was blue. Amish brides do not wear white. Mine was a deep navy my mother and I had cut and sewn over 4 evenings that October, and it was the newest thing I had ever owned in my life. Downstairs I could hear my brothers carrying benches into the front room, that heavy scraping sound wood makes against wood. The whole house already smelled like celery, because there were 9 washtubs of it out in the summer kitchen waiting to be chopped. My mother's hands were in my hair. She was pinning it the way she had pinned it every Sunday morning of my life, and I remember thinking that this was the last time she would ever do it, and that I should try to hold on to how it felt. Then her hand stopped. She said, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "No," and my mother said, "Good," and she went downstairs to start the coffee. That was it. That was the whole conversation. That was everything my mother ever taught me about the wedding night. One question I did not know how to answer, and one word. I have thought about that word for 20 years. Good. Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "Come find me tonight." Not, "Let me sit down." Good. And it took me most of my adult life to understand what my mother was actually feeling when she said it, because it was not indifference and it was not cruelty. It was relief. Here is what I did not know when I came back down those stairs the next morning as a married woman. I did not know the words for parts of my own body, not in English and not in Pennsylvania Dutch. I did not know what was supposed to happen or in what order or that there was an order. I did not know that discomfort was a thing a person was allowed to mention out loud. I was 20 years old. I could cook a meal for 200 people. I could pull a calf alone in February in the dark. And I did not know one single true thing about the night that was supposed to turn me into a wife. But that is not really what this story is about, because 4 years later I found out something that changed how I understood my mother completely. And it started with 8 words my friend Rebecca said to me in a garden row while we were picking beans. 8 words that told me some Amish mothers do talk to their daughters, that there is an entire quiet tradition of it that nobody had ever told me existed, and that the reason I got 1 word and Rebecca got a whole afternoon had almost nothing to do with how much our mothers loved us. What I am about to tell you about how this knowledge moves through Amish families and how it fails to, is going to make you angry. And if you grew up in a house anything like mine, it might do something worse than that. It might make you feel recognized. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in LaGrange County, Indiana, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where women like me finally say out loud the things we spent our whole lives not being allowed to say. If you want to keep hearing the truth about plain life from the people who actually lived inside it, subscribe and tap the like button. And in the comments, tell me what country you are watching from. I read every single one of them. Then tell me one more thing, because I have wondered about it for years. Did your mother ever have that conversation with you, or did you get some version of my 1 word? Now let me explain something that took me a long time and a lot of therapy to understand, because the answer to the question in the title of this video is not simply nothing. It is that there are 4 kinds of Amish mothers, and which one you get is almost entirely luck. The first kind is the mother who says nothing at all. That was mine. Not a word before, not a word after. The wedding happens, the daughter moves into a new house, and the subject is never raised again as long as either of them lives. In my church district, this was the most common kind by a wide margin. The second kind says 1 sentence. Just 1. My cousin Lydia got hers on the front porch the evening before her wedding, and the sentence was, "It is your duty, and you will be fine." That is the entire text. Lydia told me years afterward that she repeated those 8 words to herself over and over that whole first week like a hymn, because they were all she had been given and she was trying to make them be enough. They were not enough, but the shape of that sentence tells you everything about what the community believed. Duty first. Reassurance second. Information never. The third kind is the mother who speaks in code. This one is more common than outsiders would ever guess, and it is where things get genuinely strange. She will not name anything. What she will do is stand in her kitchen with her daughter the week before the wedding and say something that sounds completely ordinary, and then look at her a moment too long. A remark about the pantry, a remark about the garden, a sentence about what is on a particular shelf. The daughter either understands or she does not, and the mother will never clarify, because clarifying would mean admitting out loud that a conversation is happening. A woman I knew in Shipshawana told me that 3 days before her wedding, her mother handed her a folded dish towel and said, "There is nothing in this house you do not already have." That was the whole message. She spent the first month of her marriage turning that sentence over, convinced it meant she should be more grateful. It did not mean that. It meant something completely practical, and it took her most of a year to understand it, and by then she had stopped expecting it to mean anything at all. I know women who worked out what their mothers meant on their wedding night. I know women who worked it out 2 years later. And I know at least one woman who never worked it out and who is still, to this day, absolutely certain her mother never told her anything. And then there is the fourth kind, the mother who sits her daughter down and actually tells her, plainly, without metaphor, what the body does, what is normal, what is not normal, what to do if something hurts, what a husband may not be told and may need to be told anyway. That mother exists. She is rare, and she is quiet about being that way, because in a community built on Gelassenheit, on yielding, on not putting yourself forward, a woman who thinks she knows better than the general silence is a woman flirting with Hoshmut. Pride, which in our world is the worst thing a person can be accused of. 4 kinds of mothers. And here is the part that took me years to see. It is not a scale from cold to warm. It is not that some of these women loved their daughters more. Those are the rules as I understood them at 20. Now let me tell you what is actually going on underneath them. My wedding was on a Thursday in November, after the harvest, the way they all are. 240 people. Benches in the front room and out into the shed. The service ran better than 3 hours, all of it in High German and Pennsylvania Dutch, and I sat there in my navy dress on a bench with no back to it, listening to the bishop preach on the marriage at Cana, thinking about the roast that had to come out of the oven at 11. Then the meal. Chicken and bread filling, mashed potatoes, gravy, creamed celery, 4 kinds of pie. My husband Amish and I sat at the Eck, the corner table, where everyone can see the new couple and nobody can quite talk to them. People came past all afternoon. Older women squeezed my wrist and said I would make a good wife. My mother-in-law cried. My own mother did not, and I remember noticing that and filing it away and being unable to decide what it meant. We did not leave for a honeymoon. There is no such thing. We went upstairs in my parents' house, in the same hallway I had walked down for 20 years, with 60 people still downstairs finishing the pie. I am not going to describe what happened in that room, partly because this platform has rules about it, and partly because the physical part is honestly not the part I remember. What I remember is that I had no words. Not embarrassment about the words, no words. When something did not feel right, I had no sentence available to me for saying so. Not one. And so I said nothing at all. And Amish took my silence to mean everything was fine, because what else would a person take it to mean? I lay there afterward, listening to the buggies going out one at a time down the lane, my aunts calling to each other, a horse refusing to back into the shafts. Ordinary sounds from the life I had lived that morning. And I remember thinking very clearly that something enormous had just happened to me, and that there was no living person I was permitted to describe it to. That feeling lasted, in one form or another, for 4 years. now. Rebecca and the beans. Rebecca was 3 years older than me and had married into our district from Napanee. We were picking beans in her garden in July, both of us squatting in the row, and we were talking about her sister who was getting married that fall. And Rebecca said, completely casually without looking up, "I hope her mother does it as well as mine did." I said, "Does what?" And Rebecca stopped picking. I watched her face go through about 4 expressions, and the last one was pity, and I have never forgotten it. She said, "Martha, did your mother not talk to you?" I said no. And Rebecca sat down right there in the dirt between the rows and told me what her mother had done. The night before Rebecca's wedding, her mother had come up to her room with a lamp and shut the door and sat on the edge of the bed and talked to her for close to 2 hours. Plainly, she told her what would happen. She told her what her own first months had been like, and that it had not been easy and that this was ordinary and not a failure of faith. She told her that if something hurt, it was allowed to be said out loud, to her husband, in words, and that a good man would want to hear it. She told her what was in the kitchen that could help and exactly what to do with it. And at the end, she told Rebecca that when Rebecca had a daughter, she was to do the same thing, in the same room, the same way. Because Rebecca's grandmother had done it for Rebecca's mother, that was the moment the whole thing came apart for me in the middle of a bean row. It was not about who was kind and who was cold. It was not about which mothers were modern and which were strict, because Rebecca's family was more conservative than mine in every visible way. It was that in some families this thing had been handed down, mother to daughter, for generations like a recipe or a quilt pattern. And in some families, at some point, somebody's mother died young, or somebody's mother was too ashamed, or somebody's mother simply was not told, and the chain broke. And once it breaks, it stays broken, silently, for 100 years. And nobody down the line even knows that a thing is missing, because the missing thing was never named in the first place. Some things get passed down in families like a quilt pattern, and some things get passed down like a gap in one. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you what makes this so hard to fix from inside the community. The Ordnung, the unwritten code that governs everything from the width of a hat brim to whether you may own a tractor, has a great deal to say about how a woman dresses and almost nothing to say about what she is told. There is no rule against a mother speaking to her daughter, not one. The bishop never forbade it. The church never forbade it. That is what makes it so much worse, honestly, because there was no wall. There was only the fact that nobody had ever done it in our line, and in a plain community you do not do what is not done. That is a kind of control that does not need enforcement. Nobody has to stop you from opening a door if you have never once seen anyone open it. And I want to say something about Amos because this part matters, and I do not want it misunderstood. Amos was 24. He could rebuild a hay baler with the parts he had on hand. He could look at a field in April and tell you what it would yield in September. And he knew almost nothing more than I did. His father had not talked to him. His older brothers had not talked to him. What the men in our district exchanged on the subject amounted to jokes at the sale barn, and jokes are not instruction. They are a way of standing near a subject without touching it. So there were 2 people in that room, and neither one of them had been given anything. The silence in an Amish community does not only fail the women, it fails everybody in the house. It just costs the women more. I finally asked my mother about it when I was 26. We were sitting at her kitchen table snapping beans into a bowl between us, and I do not know what made me do it that day, except that Rebecca's face in the garden row had been sitting in my chest for 2 years. I asked her why she had never said anything to me before my wedding. She kept snapping beans for a long time, long enough that I thought she was not going to answer at all. And then she said, "I stood outside your door that night for a while. I said, 'Why didn't you come in?' And my mother said, 'Because I didn't have anything to give you.' I asked my mother once before I married your father. She told me it wasn't a thing we discussed. Then she said, 'I have been ashamed of that answer for 30 years. We did not talk about it again, not once, ever. But she reached across the bowl and put her hand flat on the back of my hand for a second, which in my family was roughly the equivalent of another woman weeping. After I left, and after the shunning settled into its permanent shape, the returned letters, the phone that rings and rings at my brother's shop, the fact that I have never met 4 of my nieces. I sat in a therapist's office in Fort Wayne and told her that whole story, the hairpins and the one word and the beans. And she said something I have thought about nearly every day since. She said, "Silence isn't always something someone does to you. Sometimes it's just the only thing they had to hand down." I sat with that for a long time, and what came up underneath it was not anger at my mother. It was grief for her. Because she had been 20 years old in a room once too, with nobody to ask, and she had gotten through it the only way she knew, which was to decide it must be normal. And then, 30 years later, she stood outside my door with nothing in her hands and went back to bed. I want to be fair about the world I come from, because I am not interested in telling you it was all darkness. It was not. When our neighbor's barn burned in March, there were 60 men on that foundation inside of a week and nobody sent a bill. When my father was dying, there was not 1 hour of one day that my mother was alone in that house. I have a work ethic that has carried me through every hard year since I left, and I have never in my life met an English family with anything like the density of that community. Those things were real, and I will not pretend otherwise. But there is no scripture that requires a woman to walk into her own marriage with nothing. There is no commandment that makes a mother's shame holy, and there is no version of God I can believe in now who made a woman's body and then arranged for her to spend 4 years of her life unable to say a single true sentence about it to another person. My younger sister Emma married 2 years after I did. The night before her wedding, I went up to her room with a lamp and I shut the door, and I sat down on the edge of her bed, and I did the thing that nobody had ever done for me. It was the single most frightening conversation of my life, and I fumbled it, and I said some things badly, and at one point Emma laughed at me out of pure nerves and then apologized for laughing. But I told her, all of it, plainly, without metaphor, the way Rebecca's mother had done it in Napanee, and at the end I told her that when she has a daughter, she is to do the same thing, in the same room, the same way. That is how a chain gets started. Somebody just decides to be the first link. If you grew up in a house where the most important things were the ones nobody ever said out loud, I see you. If you were handed a life you had no instructions for and then judged on how well you carried it, I see you. If you have ever been angry at your mother for a silence and then found out later that she was handed the same silence by hers and did not know there was any other way to be, I see you especially. She was not the wall. She was just standing where the wall had always been. You were never too much for asking. You were only ever the first person in your line who thought to ask. Tell me in the comments what stayed with you. Tell me which of the 4 mothers you had. And if you are the one in your family who decided to break it, tell me that too, because I want to read it. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.